Welcome back. You're listening to Weekly Review on TBS EFM, and I'm your host, Rob Awahand. It is time now for Media in Check, where we take a little closer look at some of the compelling topics and issues related to the media. And today, as usual, we have Angela Jung here in the studio. Hello, Angela.
Hello, Rob. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's so great to see you again and great to be back.
Yes.
When I go on social media, one thing I notice is the phrase mental health is being used a lot more casually, like things like, oh boy, too much arguing online these days. I'm going to take a mental health break from social media. Right? Have you heard people using mental health kind of that casually, kind of when you go around online?
Yes, sure. And I'm sort of like really personally into like yoga and meditation. And I follow a lot of those people who deal with such issues or the mental health per se. So I think I do see that pretty often, but I do agree that it's been used very casually.
Yeah, and of course, as you pointed out, depending on what circles you move in online, there are some groups where they use that language a lot and quite freely.
That's right.
But our topic today is connected to mental health, which is why I'm bringing it up. So what is our topic exactly?
Yeah, so today's topic is about media portrayal of mental illness and criticism on their views. There's a lot of media coverage on mental illnesses these days on news report and even dramas. But at the same time, the media have been the subject of criticism as there are growing voices against how the media have described mental illness. Last year, a day before Day of People with Disability, the National Human Rights Commission and Schizophrenia Recovery Association denounced the media for confirming prejudice against people with mental disability. And more recently, the topic I'll delve into today, several broadcasting networks, including NBN, recently received administrative guidance penalties from the Korea Communications Commission for instigating prejudice against criminal suspects who have mental illness.
Okay, now this is I hear that phrase in news coverage sometimes, right, of crime. And it's sometimes used almost like a kind of an easy out excuse, right? Like, oh, well, it was mental illness, which, of course, misrepresents what mental illness actually is and kind of gives an easy scapegoat. But if you ever, ask the mental health community or people who are the English phrase we use is neurodivergent. They have some very strong opinions about what it means when people point to mental health like that. So what are the broadcasting networks doing that caused this penalty?
Yes, so 6 civil complaints had been filed arguing some media reports mentioned the suspect's history of mental illness in the process of reporting criminal cases, portraying mental illness as the cause for crimes, and instigating prejudice against the medical conditions. KCC's Communications Review Subcommittee held a meeting on March 15th to review these cases and decided to impose administrative guidance for 5 broadcasting networks.
Okay, and which broadcasting networks or which shows were subject to these penalties?
So MBN's Good Morning received a recommendation. KBS News Square and News 9, MBC News Desk, and OBS News are subject to opinion suggestion, which are the lowest level of penalty. And JTBC's newsroom was freed as the subcommittee concluded there's no questionable element in the episode.
Okay, so there were lower penalties, not severe penalties, kind of a first warning situation perhaps.
Right.
But what was the conclusion of the subcommittee? I'd like to hear more about their findings.
Yes, so the subcommittee assessed that broadcasting networks violated the broadcasting review regulations, particularly a clause on reporting criminal cases that says broadcasting networks must exercise caution in disclosing suspects' personal information, especially related to mental health, and must not define mental illness as the cause for a criminal act without any objective evidence.
Yeah, because that's an easy stereotype to make, right?
Right.
Please go on.
Yoon Sung-ok, a member of subcommittee, said, even though the fundamental problem lies with the police, the provider of the source, which was media, should be more careful considering that this matter is a human rights issue related to both mentally ill person and his or her family members. The subcommittee added, if a report mentioned the mental health and crime history of suspects for the sake of social welfare, it would require different considerations or criteria. However, if they just report it out of context without any statement from investigator or without looking into whether the history of mental illness constitutes the cause of a crime, viewers could be really easily misled or mistaken.
Yeah, and this kind of underlines how media holds a position of public trust. We trust the media to get things right because we get so much information about the world from the media.
Exactly.
So this issue has been criticized in several fronts, and I imagine on the government level also there has been action.
Yes, definitely. So fortunately, there's meaningful, long-awaited progress made recently after the Ministry of Health and Welfare decided to partially accept recommendations as part of an effort to break the existing prejudice against mentally ill people. In a reply to the Commission request, the ministry stated it will establish criteria regarding mental health portrayed in media and add cooperation clauses in Mental Health Welfare Act to ensure that the recommendations will be complied with. A National Human Rights Commission explained the proliferation and reproduction of press articles on two cases, especially 2018 assassination of Professor Im Se-won and the 2019 murder committed by An In-duk, only highlighted how dangerous and violent schizophrenia is, aggravating negative biases against the mental condition.
Yeah.
So the commission added the media stigmatized mentally ill patients as potential criminals and maximized terror and fear. As a matter of fact, the crime rate among mentally ill people was actually lower than that of the ordinary people.
Yeah. Now, before we came in to do this meeting, I did just a very small amount of searching on, your average search engine. It doesn't take long at all to find data that, the crime rate of mentally ill people is lower. And actually, the chance that they're going to be the victim of violence is quite a bit higher than the chance that they're going to be the one doing violence.
Right.
But talking about this stigma is important because if there's a stigma, number one, it can lead to discrimination. But number two, the stigma also leads to people who need help not asking for it, which means that people who need help don't get the help they need. So do you have any data that can help persuade people that, this stigma is not needed?
Right. So I do have data. I have supporting data from 2016 crime analysis report by the Supreme Prosecutor's Office. It shows that the crime rate of mentally ill people was a mere 1/4 the rate of the ordinary population. So even in violent crime, severely violent crimes such as murder, robbery, arson, and sexual violence, the crime rate of the entire population was 0.294%, whereas the rate of violent crimes committed by the mentally ill people was 0.055%. In addition, due to the persistent biases, there was a spread of NIMBY mentality and hatred, where local communities rejected the installation of relevant facilities, and all of these resulted in the creation of measures that strengthen control and management of those with mental diseases.
Yeah. Now, NIMBY, that's short for not in my backyard, kind of build your mental health facility in someone else's neighborhood. But what about in other countries? Are there similar issues?
So as I see this issue, there's a stark contrast to that of the U.S. As far as I know, mental disease has not been frequently used as an excuse for committing crimes, or at least on TV shows. And Canada and Britain can serve as a precedent in setting up media guidelines related to mental health and establish systematic monitoring.
Yeah, I know it hasn't always been like that. When I was younger, I remember movies like Psycho and Silence of the Lambs that very clearly connected violence with mental illness. So it's nice to know that that's changing, though, and that these guidelines are having an effect. Now, I was wondering, what do you think about this matter yourself as a person working in the media industry?
Yeah, so it's true that a growing number of people who commit crimes take advantage of mental illness as their excuse for what they did. And the media has contributed to this to some degrees. Because, for example, popular dramas such as Juvenile Justice on Netflix and 악의 마음을 읽는 자들, they also show several characters who falsely claim that they're mentally ill. And they do so just to get away with the consequences they have to pay.
Yeah.
Yes. I think people in the media and society as a whole should be more keenly aware of what we do and the ripple effects. Because I think the media's role is critical in building or correcting public perception or prejudice on anything because media is the primary and the most influential source of information for the public. They can start by refraining from relating any mental conditions to excuses for committing crimes. And lastly, there's no doubt that there's a step in the right direction for the Ministry of Welfare to finally take on this matter as a welcome response to rectify the prejudice against those with mental illnesses. But for Korea, that has a deep-rooted biases against several matters. I personally think there's still a long way to go to break the persistent prejudice against people with mental disabilities and others.
Yeah, and that's, changing that public conversation. It takes leadership from the media, but not just that. It takes time to change the way people think and the way people talk about an issue like this.
Right.
As a person working in the broadcasting industry, but also as a person who has in my family conditions like autism and ADHD, I've seen how the media portrayal of these things creates stereotypes that hurt people I love. I've also seen how when it goes untreated, problems get bigger. But when people get a diagnosis, it actually makes their life a lot better because, my nephew or my niece, their teacher knows what to do, knows what the issue is, and has books and strategies and teaching tips to deal with it, and parenting tips as well. Getting that diagnosis actually makes life better for everyone. So taking away the stigma so that people don't feel shy about finding out what's going on
exactly
can actually create a healthier society that's supportive of people with mental illness, but also just makes it easier to talk about this stuff.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this issue to our attention, Angela.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yes, see you next week.
All right, that's everything for Media in Czech.